Hello, my name is Richard Watkins, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Maxwell Davies' piece Sea Eagle for solo horn. I first came across Maxwell Davies working with the Fires of London back in the 1980s. The two pieces I was involved with were his two chamber operas, The Martyrdom of St Magnus and The Lighthouse, both of which had terribly difficult horn parts. It was while we were on tour that Max came up to me one day and gave me a piece of music which was entitled A Study for Solo Horn. And he said, I thought you might be interested in this and thought you might be able to slip this into a recital somewhere. I immediately heard the immortal words that came out of my mouth was, this looks terrific, why don't you write some more? So in actual fact, the term Sea Eagle is slightly misleading for this first movement because it was just literally a study. It was while he was writing the slow movements and the third movement, the finale, that he was actually he was working on his remote island in the Orkney Islands, where he opened his croft cottage door, and right in front of him was a sea eagle, which was slightly unusual at the time because they were more or less extinct. There was a breeding program on the west coast of Scotland, so with your geography, from the island of Mull to Orkney is quite a long way, so this was a little bit of a surprise to him. The Sea Eagle and Maxwell Davies both share one thing in common, in that they both had very, very piercing, staring eyes. And Max said he felt slightly uncomfortable in the fact that the Sea Eagle was looking him up and down, and just thought maybe he was just a little bit too big, otherwise he might have made a sensational lunch. That's how the piece evolved and why it's called Sea Eagle. And I think the slow movement in particular, the imagery is very, very evocative of the sea eagle in full flight. The last movement is particularly difficult and really shows off the character of a really aggressive, ferocious side of the sea eagle. So I thought I might just take you through a few of my thoughts on the piece, and crucially point out, particularly in the last movement, where there are one or two markings missing in the part. This will make things a little bit easier. It doesn't make it easy to play, of course, by any means. And in terms of grading, I've always thought this piece doesn't really work in the difficult category. It's definitely in the ferociously difficult category. So in the first movement, in the study, or the first movement, I think it's still very important to think of the imagery of a sea eagle, that slightly broody darkness that's very prevalent with the bird. And there are a lot of these grace notes, which is very common in Maxwell Davies' writing. Of course, it's open to the individual how you interpret them and approach them. I've always thought that the grace notes sound really best if they're done in a very lyrical way. So the first two lines could sound something like this, and you'll have to excuse my rather dry acoustic in my living room. One of the reasons I've just demonstrated that a little bit, the tempo is actually marked adagio. There are no metronomes markings in the whole of the piece, so that really gives the player a complete carte blanche. And thank goodness, there are no two performances of this piece are going to be alike, which is really rather reassuring, I think. The reason I mentioned about the tempo is, if you think of the tempo, which is about, in my thoughts, a little bit something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The problem comes a little bit further down, and I quite often hear people play some of the grace notes a little bit sort of like this. This is the fourth line at the end of the bar, No, I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news here, but that last bit has to actually be all in the space of one beat. So it gives us a slightly different character, and of course it makes it that much more complicated. That's the sort of the feel of it, which gives it a slightly more kind of aggressive nature, which I think, and there are elements of that all the way through this movement. Unfortunately, the next bar, so this is a 1, 2, 3, the fifth line down, is possibly one of the most awkward and difficult bars in the whole piece. And again, I hear a lot of performances going something like this. Unfortunately, again, if you're thinking a little bit more in a tempo, that third beat of the bar is incredibly difficult. And if you're thinking of trying to practice it within a sort of tempo of this sort of feel, 1, 2, 3, it's going to sound a little bit more like this. Now, for those of you studying the part, you'll see I was a little bit free with some of the notes, and actually Maxwell Davies it beautifully described when he said I preferred the way I played it like that. He said I like the way you create a sort of more an impressionistic view of the piece, and this is very important because this comes later in the piece, in the third movement in particular. So that gives you a rough idea. And similarly, just on the penultimate line, there's another rather tricky little bit, which again, the last beat needs to be really, really quite quick. So this is the penultimate line of the first movement. And that's into the last line. So that last beat is again very, very fast. So it is worth actually practicing within us having this idea of the tempo, your own tempo, whatever you create, within, and trying to keep that within that sort of framework. Moving on to the second movement, this is actually marked lento, and it is probably the most easy, well, not the easy, the easiest movement of the three to bring off, to try and create that feeling of imagery of the bird in full flight. Again, I don't make too much of the lento. I think it's quite good to keep it moving, particularly bearing in mind if you're going to do the repeat, it's incredibly tiring. So maybe something like this is a good natural feel for this movement. So in a way, I'm almost trying to create that sort of that slow one in a bar feel. So it just keeps on moving, or flowing is a good word. Again, if you just imagine the bird in flight, that works well. So then we come to the finale, the last movement, and I'm not trying to make excuses for this, but when I was given the part, the part only arrived. The final version in the last movement only arrived a couple of weeks before the first performance, and I remember we were in Dartington, the festival, and Max said the hall was free, and he said, "Would you like to play it through?" This was about 2 or 3 days before the premiere, and I was slightly concerned when I got to the last movement. Max was in the gallery in the back of the hall, and I thought, well, presto molto, it's really, really hard. So I kind of treated it, it's ferociously difficult. And I sort of kind of tried to play it a little bit like this. That kind of thing. And so anyway, Max came down from the gallery at the end, and he said, "It sounds great, but could I ask you about the last movement, the presto molto?" And he said, "It sounds a little bit careful, a little bit safe." And I said, "Well, the trouble is, it's still a work in progress, and I'd love to be able to try. I'm going to try and get it a little more accurate. I'd love to be able to go with this sort of feel to it." And he said, "That's exactly the feeling I really wanted." So I said, "Well, to be perfectly honest, as anyone following the score, that was a little more approximate and a little more of that impressionistic view that he had mentioned before." And he said, "That's exactly the character I really want." It does actually it really does help if you try and practice some of those runs, particularly in the second line, the 732 bar. Trying to get those groups. If you do them slowly, it does make some particular significance to it, and it does work rather well. I mentioned that there are a couple of things missing, and in crucially in this movement, I need to point out on the last page. This is page 4 of the third movement. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth bar, at the end of the first bar, there should be a little comma. So we have the line before. Going from the 7/8 bar. And then into the 6/16 bar. And then two lines later on. So this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th, 7th line. The 4/8. Again, there should be a big kind of break before that. And then from here to the very end, it says this is the 5/16 bar, it says poco a poco crescendo, and crucially there's also missing and a accelerando, which does make quite a big difference. Now the big elephant in the room is the very last note, of course, that hand stop top D. What might make it a little bit easier, the penultimate line should actually have a molto ral. So the penultimate line should be bop 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 beep bop 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 beep bop bop. A big break, and then with the last line, "I wish you all the very best." It's ferociously difficult, and all the very best. But I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea, a few ideas on some of my thoughts behind the piece, and maybe just 1 or 2 markings which have been missing in the part. Ferociously difficult piece, but it is a very successful piece, and it is a very, very evocative piece, and I think it really has earned its place in our repertoire. Thank you very much.